Repeat, the weekly podcast giving you an insight into the minds of musicians with me, Ellie Rashid.
And me, Hattie Winter. This week we are speaking to the mega talented Charles Vaughan, an eclectic DJ, broadcaster and disco aficionado whose passion for the dance floor is frankly infectious. I'm pretty sure that when you listen to this interview you will hear Charles's love for the dance floor and dancing and night culture just coming through, and it's so wonderful to hear at a time where, you know, clubs aren't opening and we're not able to really let our hair down. So we really hope that you enjoy this and just get reminded of all the fantastic nights out that you've had in the past, and also more amazing ones that are yet to come. Anyway, a little bit more about Charles. As a DJ, his sets really vary. So he plays anything from pulsating jazz to international oddities to selected disco cuts and soulful house grooves. So it's a really big mixture. It's super varied and always changing. Charles is also the co-creator of Universal Sanctuary, which is a late night exploration into the crossroads of jazz and DJ culture, which we touch on in this episode. And that's hosted on Worldwide FM with the very lovely Tina Edwards. As a DJ, Charles has also played for the world famous Boiler Room, where he supported esteemed selector Colleen Cosmo Murphy. Plus, he's played at the likes of Pickle Factory and Brixton Jamm, which are two very well-known clubs in London. In this episode, we really discuss the history of dance floor, disco, jazz, and discuss the continuation of jazz through the medium of DJing, and that's Charles's little thing. We'll let him tell you more. Also, how to keep a bond with the crowd, and of course, Charles gives us tips on requesting songs in a respectful manner. So whilst there's not been any summer weddings this year, I'm sure that there'll be ones coming up, and make sure that you treat your DJ nicely. We hope that you're loving this track in the background as much as us. It's aptly called I Just Want to Party and really sets the tone for the rest of the show. So do stay locked in and keep it on repeat. And don't forget, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, Ellie and I would really, really appreciate a little 5-star review. You can also leave some text and, I don't know, maybe give us some feedback. But equally, if you just want to leave a rating, that's A-okay with us. So yeah, keep it locked on repeat with Charles Vaughan.
I don't think I'll ever move out of South London. Actually, I'm currently in the process of maybe thinking about moving to New York at some point next year.
Cool. Is that for
which would be fun.
Work, pleasure, business?
For
both?
work, pleasure, business, all of them. I have this idea for a PhD I want to do, but it's kind of focusing on DJing, but also linking it to jazz and disco. As like a continuation of them as art forms in a way. And then I've been doing a lot of research and digging up and become a lot more familiar with New York in the 60s, 70s and 80s and the sort of underground dance movement through working with a couple of different party crews and interviewing people. And I've always wanted to go to New York, and I was like, well, why don't I try and do a study there and like do like a master's and immerse myself in the culture and then kind of use that to bring back and do a PhD. But it's very early days thoughts. I have no idea. It's just sketching out some rough ideas in my head. But I just love the energy of New York and its creativity and its history. It's just incredible.
But what is your thesis, like in a nutshell?
Good question. I had this kind of like weird bubbling idea that sort of DJing as an art form is like a continuation of jazz and improvisation. The differentiation between people who just play jazz and then using turntables, CDJs, and mixers in a improvisational manner to create new tones and methods and textures, kind of weaving these kind of threads and weaving these understandings of music between genres in a way that I think is really jazz. Because if I think about jazz and what drew me to jazz is the way it can blend so many genres and sounds and textures together in a really mesmerizing way and create something entirely new out of it. The formation of jazz alone was from so many other genres. It was a melting pot, and I think DJing is that too. That just strikes me as like exactly the same as the way that, you know, any saxophonist might be, you know, experimenting with what they can be doing with their instrument, what they can get out of their instrument in different ways. So that was the melting pot for that. That was originally a sort of thesis idea, but now I'm sort of, I've been studying so much disco at the moment, and I'm really getting into the history of it, and now I'm like kind of interested in doing something more towards disco as well as jazz. But lots of ideas bouncing around in my head, basically. Yeah.
I love the idea of like the improvisation in DJing because and jazz, because it's totally true, because you can see like it's always different. It hasn't really existed before, and it won't really exist like again.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really unique experience. Whereas a jazz band, they feed off sort of the energy of each other on stage. The DJ has a symbiotic three-way relationship of the audience and the sound system and the space, which I think is like really unique. If you look at jazz spaces and how they've evolved, it's evolved in much the same way that clubs have in a large scale. And taking that energy is kind of how the DJs feed into creating their set and performance. And like you say, it's totally unique. My favorite DJs will just make links between tracks. I never thought that there could be a link between. That's always my favorite moments. That feeling I get when I watch bebop, when people are like on the edge, and I feel I'm on the edge as they're pushing it in new directions and pushing the flow and the energy of the music until it breaks in that way. I think it's just so similar that you can't really ignore it, in my humble opinion.
Do you use that kind of feeling and energy and belief like when you're kind of planning your sets, or how planned are they in the?
They vary a lot. Some sets are planned, some sets aren't. It's a mixture of the two. I guess that's, having been a jazz musician, that's similar to jazz. Some of it's planned, some of it's not. A lot of sets I do, because I do a lot of like bar sets and stuff like that. They're not planned. If I turn up to, for example, my residency at Near and Far Camden, it's a 5-hour set. I've just given 5 hours to kind of do what I want. I could try and plan 5 hours, but there's no point. And that's normally the ground in which I sort of test ideas and test links and test kind of genres that I might not have visited before. It's a really useful space because you've kind of got an open canvas with a couple of people drinking, and if you can get them slightly moving to something, then you definitely know you're onto something. And if you can take that idea and then translate that to a more club setting, you sort of guaranteed to, you've already tested it, you've already seen people's reactions. It's shitty at times, but it's such a learning curve. If you've got this crowd who are just so not into deep Chicago house, but you want to get them to it, you've got to be like, right, well, how do I get them on side? Like, what ways do I go? So you're like, okay, well, I dig through and I play them something they might know, and then I play something really funky that I know they just you can't not move, and it's like keeping that energy and building it so you can pull them in, and then you've taken them to a place that you never thought you had. And I guess that's what, as a difference to jazz, I think DJing can be definitely more approachable in that form. DJing really, I think, enables people to experience these genres and these styles in a really approachable manner, because you're in an open experience, and if you don't like a tune, you can just walk to the bar and get a drink, and if it's not working in the room, the DJ will move on and move in a new direction.
Definitely. I also agree that DJing is changing, because also you can now, there's more opportunity to practice. I think because you used to have to have, like hundreds and thousands of vinyls and, really amazing turntables. But I do think that there has been a bit of a democratization of music technology. So people can get, much cheaper controllers. It's still not totally accessible. You still have to fork out some money for it, but you don't now need like your Pioneer club standard DJ controllers to do something from home. You can get like even like secondhand like Newmarks and obviously like Tractor and stuff. You can get them really cheap now just to practice your mixing and hone your craft.
100%. And I think a lot of people give criticism to, the new wave of controllers and the digital DJing era. And I just think they're just different instruments in a way that, an alto sax is different from a tenor sax, which is different from a bari sax. They're just there for different things. They provide a different sound. They provide a different form of interaction, No one, if you're picking up the saxophone, no one's going to start you on a baritone saxophone. That makes no sense. You start on an alto, and then you work your way to that. The same way that for so many people these days, the approachable way in is controllers, like you say. It's a complete democratization of the technology behind it. And I learned on a controller, 10 years ago now, that I bought from Argos for £25.
Yeah.
And that's just how I learned. I just sat at my desk and, you played one track and then you were like, so if I cut the bass out of the other track and then bring it in, that sounds like that. And that's just kind of how you learn from it. And I remember when I was tutoring DJing, a lot of people got very frustrated that they didn't have CDJs. And CDJs, if you do have a Pioneer setup, that can really help you take your DJing to the next level of what you might have in a club. There's definitely no doubt about that. But it's not a waste of time practicing on a controller. You look at some huge DJs still go on controller. Look at Kate Trinada still DJs on a Tractor Control S4.
Yes, he does.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, literally, I saw him in Paris 2 years ago, and it was one of the best DJ sets I've ever seen. And it was so simple. I'm like 100% sure it was still all on sync, but it didn't matter because the set and what he was building around it was great. So why did it matter how it was delivered? Same with, actually, interestingly, Object Blue. She's talked a lot about how she DJs with everything on quantized on the CDJs, because she's like, the point is, for me, is not for beat matching. I'm trying to do 3-4 CDJs worth of textures at any one point. I haven't got time to beat match. So why shouldn't I be able to use this tool to enable me to be creative in other ways, which I think is a really fresh way of approaching it.
Yeah, man. Say it louder for the people in the back. This weekend, you're looking at like sort of planning a lot of your sets. You've got like this 15-minute set, which is a really, really short time. I'm quite surprised because it is short. Yeah, and I'm very much used to sets that are normally between 4 and 6 or 7 hours sometimes. So 15 minutes is a little challenging, but we like a challenge. That's why we do it. We do. I was going to say, how do you maintain your creativity when you're being sort of, I guess, when you're juggling so many things?
It can be really tricky. It's definitely a balancing act. I think anyone who's a freelance creative or a musician with multiple projects or anything in that regard faces that challenge. For me, I think I've got to be passionate about what I'm working on, and that drives the creativity a lot of the time. Sometimes I'm not passionate on projects. There are certain projects that I do that sometimes I'm not passionate on, and I can see that I'm not as passionate because my energy going into it isn't nearly as high, my creativity isn't as high. But I try to only take projects on that I know I really want to. I have like a really creative idea to jump on. That being said, I'm just generally quite an energetic person. Like I do really like just getting stuck in and doing too much work. That's just the way I kind of am. So I normally don't have too much difficulty with that. But I think sometimes what I've learned more in the last couple of years is previously I definitely try to force creativity in certain moments when it needs to be done. You've got deadlines coming up, you need something out. And I think what I've learned more than ever is just to take time off that project and on some other project and then come back to it with a fresh mind, and that just does me a world of good. Whereas previously, I would just sit on certain projects day and night being like, why is nothing coming out? Why can't I get this working? And then I discovered, if I just take like a couple of days off it and move in a different direction, that's so much better. Such a healthier way of approaching it.
Yeah, I think that's a totally underrated sort of way of working on it as well, and something that people should probably learn from. And I feel like that's one way to sort of control your creative energy, because you've always struck me as someone who has extremely high creative energy, and I wonder if DJing really lends itself well to that, because something that I always think when I'm watching DJs perform, maintaining long sets as well, like maintaining that energy, how on earth do you do it? I mean, I've seen some of your Instagram lives and I'm just thinking, wow.
Yeah. I've had a lot of people tell me that I'm quite an energetic person behind the decks, as anyone who's seen me will tell me or booked me, because I think you get a lot of images these days of DJs and they're playing their boiler room sets and they're doing the classic, like the little bob with a couple of little things. First and foremost, the reason why I DJ is because I love to dance and I love music and I love dancing to music live. Like I like being in a club space. If I'm not DJing on a weekend, I will try and go to a club to just go and dance in front of a DJ. I like it. It's fun. It's really good. And when you're getting to dictate the energy and the movement and the tunes that you want to hear. It just, for me, it just peaks my energy in a way that I just can't describe. If you just go 100 miles an hour for 5 hours, you're just going to tire them out. But like sets like that, you've really got to pace yourself out. You can't, that's so hard because you get people pouring in and people are sort of at the stage and they're like, we want this. They want the energy, and you've got to build it. You can't just jump in at the peak point, because you build energy on energy on energy. And then it gets more and more down to the point that if you mess it up, you'll lose everyone, and then they'll just drop to the bar. Because I find the longer you build the energy and you keep the momentum going, the quicker people will just take a break out of any slight mistake or any slight tune going the wrong way.
That's so cool. So, you're talking about like all this energy that you have, and obviously your audience feeds off from that energy as well. Do you ever have time where, like some downtime where you're like, okay, I'm going to chill now? Or do you feel like you're always quite energetic? Because when I speak to a lot of performers, and I think I'm probably this type of performer as well, I'm quite low energy actually, but it takes a lot for me to sort of get into that place, and I have to almost get into a completely different headspace for whether I'm doing music practitioner work or performance and stuff like that. And it's not that it's not me, it's just an aspect of me, but I just can't be that high energy all the time. Do you think that you're someone who just is always at that level and you're fully yourself, or do you need time just to kind of like, I don't know, on your own, just to gather that energy?
I definitely am a high energy person in general, in outside of music as well as inside music. Most of my friends are like, Jesus Christ, you're mad, how do you just keep going all the time? But I do have, like anyone, I have to take moments for myself to experience and enjoy it. And I think I do have those moments when I DJ. Often the last half hour of my sets, especially when I've had a really good set, they'll normally just be kind of sort of the end of the night moments, soul groovers, and I go more into selecting, and there's a good differentiation to make there between being a selector and being a DJ, because they're very different things. And when I do more selecting stuff, i.e. when I play like Spiritland, one of my favorite places on earth, and the honor of just selecting records for 5 hours was incredible. And that's not, I wasn't dancing around behind the decks. It's a restaurant, people are eating, you can't just go mental. So taking that space and really just feeling the music in a new way, I really adore that as well. It's not something I do as much, but when I get the opportunity to have that freedom and space to explore those kind of more gentle cuts, it's a really nice experience. I used to do a lot of ambient sets with an extended DJ setup I had, where I had the CDJs going into my 2-track tape deck and also some programming in Max MSP, and I used to try and make new textures out of this ambient stuff, and it was all very like slow moving, just like playing with the different tones you could get out of the kit I had. And yeah, I miss doing that a lot. Not that I don't love what I do now and where I am, and I look forward to seeing what I do in 3 years' time. I might not be doing high energy stuff. I might just be back to playing jazz in bars and chilling out, But I definitely need that space, and sometimes I'm lucky enough to get gigs or mixes where I can show that side of me, which is, it's great to have that balance.
Definitely. You produce as well?
I do, yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, like listening to you talk, you seem to take on a lot of responsibility of like the relationship between the DJ and the crowd. Do you kind of have the same responsibility when it comes to like producing music, and you're thinking about how people will react to it and what you're making?
So funny, it's a total opposite when I make music, actually. I've gone through so many different stages of making music, and right now I make music for no one else except me. It's just fully on my own terms. I've lost the kind of energy to make music that I used to have. I still enjoy it. It's a nice hobby, but it's not. Previously, it was like years ago, it was like my first and foremost thing, and then I DJ'd on the side, and then very quickly I discovered that I just enjoyed performing live. Performing live as a musician, I just found sucked. It was just so many things holding me back. And when I DJ'd, it was like, right, you can play for 8 hours over genres you've never played before, and have so much energy, and all you need is this one USB to get you going. You know, we were talking previously about this kind of entry level idea for DJing. You know, you just need a USB and you're off. Whereas when I was trying to do my live electronic sets, when I was doing more ambient and dubstep stuff, it would take, you know, you'd spend weeks getting your program set up to be able to play. And I still felt like I wasn't fully engaging with the music. I hated the idea of playing to a backing track. So I just got to this point a couple of years ago where I was like, you know what, I want to stop trying to think about what this music means and what I'm trying to do. I just want to make some tunes that are fun and just for me and I'll enjoy. So I started doing these little disco edits. I think this started like a year and a half ago, where I'd sort of take some classic samples from some funk and soul tunes and make them into sort of disco house tunes. I found the multi-track of Shake Your Body Down to the Ground, Jackson 5, Michael Jackson even. And I was like, you know what? Every time I play this in the club, it doesn't hit hard enough. I want to just do a version where it hits hard and I want a bassy version so I can listen to on my headphones and it thump a bit. And I did that and it was really fun. And I've just kept doing that now for a bit because it's just fun, you know. I don't really think about what the audience might do. Sometimes when I'm like producing on a track, I might be like, oh, I do want the audience to kind of build in this way. But most times it's like, what do I want to hear? What do I want to hear out this sample or this source material? Like currently I'm working on I never thought I'd work on a remix of Dua Lipa.
Oh my God, that is amazing. Sorry. So good.
I've got way more into pop music in the last sort of 6 months owing to, I don't know, just sometimes getting burnt out with listening to so much DJ stuff and music stuff, and I've just been like, just shove on some pop. You know, I just want to bop to something. Also, I downloaded TikTok like 6 months ago, and that's ruined my life.
Lockdown.
Yeah, bigger. No, that was pre-lockdown. That's the worrying thing. But the thing I find interesting about TikTok is you hear these sounds over and over and over again, and I found some incredible music through TikTok. There's a lot of awful music on there and awful trends. But I found everything from proto-acid disco classics from the 70s that I never knew about to some krautrock, which has been good. I found really incredible like hip-hop stuff. Literally the mix I was preparing upstairs, the 15-minute one of the tracks is from TikTok. It's this incredible future funk tune that someone had just posted a little like dancing joke to, and I was like, this is a great track. Like, what is this doing on this app? This shouldn't be here. And yeah, the Dua Lipa track was very viral on there, and I just kept hearing that loop, and I was just listening to it in the shower one morning, and I was like, you know what? It'd be really fun if someone just shoved a kick drum on it and just made it groove a little. And I was like, yeah, that's all I'll do for it. And I just sat down at my keyboard, flashed out some ideas, and now it's the biggest Ableton track I've worked on in ever. So I don't know how that happened, but it was just for me. I was like, yeah, this will be fun to release, and lots of people have messaged being like, this sounds cool. But ultimately, it was just like, I was like, oh, this sounds cool. What if I looped it and just made it a disco track? That'd be fun. So I think my approach to production is a lot less considered than my DJing approach, just because it's more a thing for me to have fun with, I think.
It's so interesting you talk about TikTok as well. Bring it back to TikTok.
Don't get me started on TikTok. I could do this entire thing on TikTok.
To be honest, I didn't know. I did a project about use of pop music in early years education. So one of the big things was actually dancing, and of course that's so relevant to what you're doing. And I didn't know a lot about TikTok before I did this project, and it was actually, I mean, people started to talk about it, and I was like, okay, yeah, I must look into this. Then my younger sister WhatsApped me. She was like, I'm TikTok famous now. And then I looked into it. I was like, what is this? And then I saw, like you, all of these tunes. I was like, yeah, this is a tune like that. Do, 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 do. And like, all this girl, I must want you. And like all these things. I was like, people, and now my sister as well, she has a playlist. She's a bit younger, but she has a playlist of just all TikTok tunes. And the sort of genre variety you get from that is amazing, and just the fact that it's all for dancing, you know, whether you like the dancing or not is kind of not the point, but it's like that energy thing that you're talking about and getting people moving. I think and actually I was thinking genre wise, you talked about Dua Lipa, you talked about disco, you talked about ambient music, but do you ever feel like people pin you to disco or jazz ever?
Really good question, because I've tackled that a lot in my head over the last couple of years. I guess I'm still kind of considered in a lot of circles to sort of be very strictly jazz, which is something I kind of gave myself. I arrived at university years ago where we all met, and I was just completely confused about how there wasn't more jazz. There was sort of a moment where it was weirdly a great time to be a jazz musician, and I remember before that when I was at school, my teachers had been like, don't try and do jazz, man, don't do it, like. And then suddenly the surge of stuff coming out, and I came to Goldsmiths and I was like, well, where is it? We're in South London. This is everything I've heard about, but where's the jazz? And then I therefore just made it my thing to set up and do as much jazz and get as much jazz around me going, which is how we met, Ellie, because the old jazz nights that I used to run, Jesus, that was a throwback.
I have a lot to thank you for that as well, because you need someone with that kind of like, we needed someone who was just going to be like, look, there's no jazz here. Where's the jazz? Bring it in. But then, you know, talking about jazz still makes me really confused, because what do you say is jazz? I always find that really difficult.
An excellent question. Prepare me for a Guardian article on what is jazz in the modern age. I think jazz can be so many things. For me, I know jazz when I hear it. A good way for me to define is I sometimes have to define what is jazz, because when I download tunes and I have music that I need to put on my USBs have folders, and they're normally organized primarily by genre and then other weird things under that. So when I get a tune, I need to decide, is it going in a jazz folder? Is it going in a funk folder? Is it going in a more global music folder? Is it going in something else? So that's really made me have to pick up on my ear of what I consider jazz. And for me, it's just like a feeling in the groove. And I think what's interesting is it can blend that some grooves are jazz but not funk, but some funk tunes will use the same groove and they're funk and not jazz. And I think it's just the approach you're getting from the band itself, if it is a band, or the vocalist or the producer, the approach you're taking. And I think the key element is there's got to be that level of improvisation in some form. You know, it doesn't have to be a full-on Coltrane solo, you know, that's breaking all levels of tonality, but it needs to have some element of, you know, this isn't just a straight groove that we're then playing over and that's it. You know, there's got to be some element of whoever's involved in it, even if it's just one person and their laptop, they've got to be feeding off each other in a way there's a way that's having that improvisational energy, which I think jazz was built off. So I guess that's kind of how I consider it.
So would you argue that DJing is one of those areas?
I mean, to me, yes. I think there's a lot of revolutionary directions. Something that really opened my mind to what jazz could be, I think, was I worked for a record label when I came out of university called On the Corner Records. I highly recommend anyone listening to go check them out. Pete's an incredible man. Working at the label and hearing some of the music that the artist involved, everyone from Tamar Colacuta, who's one of the main saxophonists on the London jazz circuit, to DJ Calab, who's an incredible Italian producer, to Dengue Dengue Dengue, which is this incredible electronic trio from South America. All this stuff, it was jazz, but it was just jazz in a way that I just at that moment in time I just never considered jazz could be in that direction. This kind of fusion of electronics and jazz, and through that, I think I started considering about how you could DJ jazz. And interestingly, the thing that really prompted me into it was when our jazz night stopped. I still had gig bookings for certain venues and people wanting to do stuff, even though, unfortunately, you know, everyone has studies and we just couldn't quite get the bands together and whatever. So I was like, well, you know what, I'll just DJ it. I guess I'll just DJ some jazz tunes. And I was like, I didn't know you could DJ jazz. To me, I was like, can can you DJ jazz? Is that a thing? And then very quickly I learned about this rich cultural history behind DJing jazz, everything from Charles starting the acid jazz movement in the 90s up until what's going on today. And for me, I started understanding that using the turntables and CDJs and the equipment in front of you in a truly unique way and trying to find new instrumentations with them and reorganizing these tracks, providing these songs which are already created and recontextualizing them in unique ways that are improvisational and momentary. That idea of like it's not going to be recreated. For me, that just it's so jazz. It's like one of the jazzest things I can think of. Like it's so jazzy. Like that's what got me into jazz, is when I was doing jazz piano lessons, is just taking a tune and completely turning it on its head and being like, well, what if we did all these reharmonizations and made it a Latin tune? Like what would that look like? And that's the same with, that's the power of the CDJ, the control of the vinyl, the DJing aspect, is you can take a song and you can rework it. It's a completely finished production. You know, you cannot change anything about any of the instruments in there, but using the tools in front of you, you completely rearrange and recontextualize the entire track. I can make, I don't know, excellent example. There's Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin was a classic tune that David Mansuki used to play at the Loft. You could take that tune and just using some of the tools, just make it into like a lo-fi hip-hop beat, just with like a couple of the tools on there, filter it down, or you could take it in a proto-disco acid kind of way really easily, and you can recontextualize all these works in ways that the original writers, publishers had never thought of. To me, that's jazz. That's just jazz at its core.
Definitely. What was your kind of first jazz experience? You kind of touched on it briefly when you were talking about your piano lessons, but do you remember anything else, or was there just like a certain moment that you were like, this is what I want to listen to, this is what I want to play?
Good question. When I changed school when I was 12, 13 to go to a sort of secondary school, upper school, and at that point, I'd done piano and saxophone, and I'd been doing classical piano and saxophone, but I'd been in the jazz band at my very first school. And apparently I had a knack for improvising, although it was just going up and down the blues scale in different ways, you know, classic. But when I had a music scholarship to this other school, and they were like, you know, you could do jazz piano if you want. And I was like, I can do a jazz. I don't have to do classical, because I hated doing classical piano. I hated how I would have a piece of music which I liked, but I wasn't allowed to vary that from what was written on the page. I remember playing Gnossienne number 3, beautiful piece. And it just, I wanted to take it in, I wanted to change it and be like, oh, what if you took longer on this chord? And what if you repeated this? And my teacher used to just get annoyed at me and be like, no, you've got to play what's written in front, or just
that
any
should
of
be in the syllabus.
Yeah, I mean that
should be.
That's my opinion. Any of Bach's invention, Bach Invention number 5 was like one of my favorite things to play, and I used to be like, what if you just, and it was like, no, you strict quavers, no swinging, absolute dead, you know. And I just, that drove me insane. And then I had the option to do jazz piano, and I started learning under a guy called Jim Blomfield. Highly recommend you go check his jazz trio's work. And the approach alone was incredible. Was that he came in, he was like first lesson, he was like, do you want to do grades? And I was like, I hate grades. He was like, cool, he was like, cool, just pick a tune in this book and we'll learn it and we'll see where we go from there. And then every week as I got more and more into it, you know, I'd pick a tune and then I'd listen to the recording, and then he'd be like, why don't you listen to this recording of it? And it would be this alternate recording by Sonny Rollins that I hadn't heard before. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then we bring that into the lesson, and he'd be like, so this is what he was doing in that. And then it was like recontextualizing it again. And it became this cycle of it. And, you know, within years, I just fully immersed myself into it. I was just kind of known in school as the guy that did jazz. It didn't have a huge, again, my school didn't have a huge jazz support. It was very classical. It was very focused on classical arts and very focused on conservatoires. And again, I set up a jazz a jazz trio with my mates because we got tired and we started doing gigs, and then the school were like, well, we'll pick that up and stuff like that. And that was just how I got into it. It was just that cycle of hearing a bit and then hearing something given to you differently, which I think is a great way of teaching, is when you're not just, and you just said like, oh, it should be in the syllabus, but that's the thing, teachers that are willing to break the syllabus even just to give a little extra context to works. I've always found the teachers have helped push me in new directions, where they've willing to be like, okay, you need to listen to this and you need to know this, but how listen to this thing that's just going to turn this on its head. And yeah, I think that was a slippery slope into jazz, basically. And here I am still doing some form of jazz.
It's funny because you talked about Bach, Schoenberg, like everyone, and I know so many jazz musicians who say that Bach is basically the start of jazz. I mean, you would argue it could be like late Romanticism or Schoenberg, I guess, or Berg, but
yeah, you got your classic 2-5-1 harmonic movements. You can't have jazz without a good 2-5-1. No, I mean, you are right, and people told me at the time, and I was like, no, he's not. And now with a bit more maturity, I'm like, yeah, I can see that. I mean, a very loose start, a very loose start in the same way that a lot of things are a very loose start to other genres. But it's definitely interesting picking that apart, I think.
But the more you talk about genres and all of these different things, I think it's amazing that you connect everything. But yeah, the more I think about it, it's like, can we keep labeling genres? Because it just seems to like jazz, like we were just talking about, it's so hard to pinpoint exactly what jazz is, and jazz is going to keep evolving like everything else. So that's why I'm finding it interesting how Spotify has started labeling things in different ways. So there's playlists like Coffee Break or Lost in the Woods or Shower, things like that. Is that
great titles? Great titles.
Yeah, I mean they are, but maybe that makes more sense. I mean, I understand it's pretty subjective. Like you might be lost in the woods and you might want to listen to some heavy metal. I don't know, but it is subjective. But is that maybe a way that things might go rather than labeling things in just jazz or?
You only have to go to a boiler room set to see a million arguments about genres and genre names. And there was a time in my life when I was, it's an absolute throwback. I don't think I've ever put this on record, but I was a dubstep producer when I was 16 with a record contract. You will get a link to this after, which will never be shared again. Technically, my most successful work, it is on Spotify, but I will not say what it is. But I used to get really, really uptight about the genre names, and it's this, because it's at this BPM. And then I kind of let it go. But I'm still not in the party and the camp of we should just abolish genre names, especially with, I don't know, there's reasons why genre names are there, and they're there for a good reason. I think giving disco the primary thing, disco is a word for me that symbolizes a rebellion against, the state, essentially, and a freedom of expression in a way that I think, loads of genres of freedom of expression, but for me, disco is one that I hold an affinity to. And the word disco, therefore, for me, and the genre and the idea of having a genre named disco is important. It tells a history. It documents, a people's fight to have this music exist. Just the very idea of the word disco was absolute heresy at one point. If you look at Disco Demolition in 1978, which is where a Midwestern rock DJ blew up a load of disco records and then started a riot through it because they were so done with disco, and that's where we got Disco Sucks from. And like for me to try to disband with genre names entirely would be a discredit to the history of what those genre names have come to represent. You think about house, you think about jazz even, we're saying, oh, is it or is it not jazz? All it is we're saying, is it or is it not a continuation of this lineage that jazz comes to represent? And I think that's still useful, and it still should be used, because by ignoring, I think if we ignore genres, we ignore the history attached to those genres potentially. I think removing the name removes the history, and a lot of that history is really important. And I wish people took it more in consideration, I think.
I totally agree. And I also think that even with like genres, history has already been erased. People will already forget things that have happened. So if you just take it away completely, it's just, inviting that to happen more.
However, I think there is a case to be made, like you said, for the way that Spotify have approached things and doing stuff more on moods and energies, because that's a perfect example of that, where you're conjuring a sense of the energy and mood of a track through a situation. I think that's a really fresh way to approach it.
Do you ever get people requesting stuff? Because I think a lot of people, when they say, "Oh yeah, I've got a DJ," like they're like, "Oh yeah, I've got to request XYZ." Do you get that, and how does it make you feel?
If I had a penny for every time I got a request, I wouldn't be in any economic difficulty ever again, I think. If you're a DJ, you obviously you would expect people to get requests. I don't think people realise how often DJs get requests, and more so how ridiculous these requests are. You really see an attitude in people when you won't play their request. Originally, years ago, I used to be more empathetic, and if someone requested something, I'd be like, "Oh no, I'm really sorry. It's a good suggestion, but I just haven't got anything." I've kind of run out of the patience for it now. Sometimes I will, depending on, if the request is appropriate, then I'll play the request. I don't know, someone requests some Earth, Wind and Fire and I'm doing a more cheesy disco set. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll try and slot in some Earth, Wind and Fire. I'm always like, there's no guarantees, but yeah. Or if I'm doing like a house set and someone's like, "Oh, have you got that Harvey Sutherland cut?" And I'm like, "Yeah, no, that's a great cut. Yeah, I'll try and slide that in." But I think the most classic story, which is now a joke and everyone takes the piss out of me, I was doing an all-vinyl funk set in Bristol on a Tuesday night, and this bloke came over and leant over, and he was like, "You got any Sean Paul, mate?" And I was like, I just kind of like looked at him and just like looked at the records in front of me and then looked at him, and he was like, "Yeah, Sean Paul." And I was like, "Let me just check my record bag," and just fake flipped through it. And I was like, "Nah, I don't think I do." And he was like, "Oh, shame, mate." And I was like, and it's just situations like that where, that one was funny, but I've had more times where people have got really annoyed. I remember one time when on my old residency at what used to be the Nines in Peckham, this woman came up to me. It was so funny. She came up and she was like, "Hi," and I could see she was like really thinking about whether she should say this, and I was like, "Oh no, this isn't going to be good." She came up and she was like, what would you call this?" And I was like, I'd call this kind of like upbeat funk, sort of edging towards disco maybe. And she was like, "Is the music going to be like this all night?" And I was like, "Yes, it's like a funk soul disco night." I was trying to be nice. I was like, "It's a funk soul like disco kind of night." And she was like, "It's going to get a bit more like dancey." And I was like, "Okay, well, this is, yeah." And I was like, I was like, towards the end, the last hour, we try and ramp it up and go with some more like, disco stuff that people will know. And she was like, "When you say disco, what do you mean?" And I was like, "What do I mean?" I was like, like disco, like I was like, I don't know, like Michael Jackson or Sister Sledge we play. I always end on Sister Sledge. And she was like, "You got like ABBA kind of thing?" And I was like, "Yeah, no, kind of like ABBA, And she was like, "Oh, so you're not going to play any hip hop?" And I was like, "No, I'm not." And she was like, "Oh, okay, we're going to go then." And I was like, "Okay, bye." And that was it. She was just like, "I'm going to leave," And I was like, "Okay, this doesn't affect me." Like, and that attitude really annoys me. Requests make me feel horrible. I hate it. If anyone is listening, please, 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 please never do a request unless you really think it's appropriate and you do it in a really nice way, because otherwise it's just a really horrible experience.
Thank you so much to Charles for the super invigorating talk. Listening back has just made me realise how much I really miss going out dancing with my friends. I'm sure I'm not the only one, but it's been a really long summer. If you liked what Charles was saying and you just want to find out more, you can find him on Instagram at @CVaughanMusic, and Vaughan is spelled Vaughan. He's got Bandcamp, website. We will put all the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review or a rating on Apple Podcasts, or you can even share it on your Instagram stories. We We love that. We love interaction. So yeah, please do share and tell your friends that you think might like it. And stay tuned for another episode next week with more amazing, creative, fabulous artists. And yeah, have a lovely week, and don't forget to keep it on repeat.
We hope you've enjoyed the episode and want to keep us on repeat. You can follow, subscribe and like us on your podcast platform of choice, and slide into our DMs on Instagram by following us at On Repeat the Podcast. All information will be included in the show notes.
On Repeat was made, produced and edited by us, and the theme music is an original piece by Ellie's jazz band Fujiyama and wonderfully resampled by Dee, the producer for the podcast. All of our guests give us permission to use their music. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to keep it on repeat.